Hi, friends. Welcome to the Recover Your Life podcast. I'm your host, Bridget Blood. Together, we are building a community of men and women who are learning what it means to grieve well, rest well, and love well, to live the life we dream of. No one is left out of this grand adventure. Now is the time to recover your life. Hi, friends. Welcome to this week's conversation. I'm so excited to be with you. We are many episodes into season 1, continuing all of our foundational conversations about what does it mean for us to be a community of men and women who grieve well, rest well, and love well. And so one of the awesome opportunities I've had on the internet this year has been getting to know Tara Riggs just through her work online, and have been able to participate in some of the workshops she's offered, and knew that her voice and her story was someone that was going to help guide us along in this journey. So Tara, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Bridget. It's so fun to be here.
I'm so excited. So I first connected to you through your work on helping women navigate reconnecting to their desire. And that has been, one of the first messages I think I sent you was, hey, I have been driving around in my car the last couple of weeks, and I literally have just had this like sense from my body, from the Lord of like, I'm good and I want to bless me. And I just began like blessing all of my desires. I blessed my desire for this podcast to be successful, and my desire for Trader Joe's peanut butter chocolate cup, or what's it called? Not chocolate cup or peanut butter cups, Trader Joe's peanut butter cups. And, just what I was hoping for my life, and just kind of began that ritual. And so then had come across your work and was like, okay, let's dive in. And that has been so significant in my story the last couple months, and just in my own healing story of really being connected to myself and learning to name that we have permission, and it is good for us to name what we want.
Yeah.
That it's not being selfish and not too much, but we actually can be really brave men and women that say, actually, I want to risk again. Because right when we do hope and we do dream, there is some pain of the past of, oh, I've tried this before and it may not have looked like I wanted it to look. And so now I'm scared to try it again. But just kind of wanting to make sure that we are continuing to show up really big and brave in our life. So
it's so
as
good.
we enter.
It's so transformative, right? Like I'm thinking about like the expansion and spaciousness and often that includes an unraveling of ourselves.
Yep.
That happens as we begin to like bless our desires and seeing like there is such goodness, there's such dignity, there's such goodness in us that we get to step into, that we get to partner with the Lord to to reign in the world, right? And like he doesn't ask us to be small, but he gives us space to occupy and welcomes us into that process. Yeah, beautiful. I'm excited for you.
So
and your
fun.
Yeah, and for me and mine too.
Absolutely. Well, I would love for you to share a little bit about your journey, your story, like now as a therapist and helping people live really powerful lives. Like what started that spark in you of your own journey of healing and showing up into, I want to be able to be a resource to help other people live in beauty and freedom as well.
Yeah. Oh, such a great question. So I kind of have, I've kind of always had this knack for, my friends in high school used to call me like their comfort blanket, right? Like I was the one that they would come to, and they would be like asking like my insight, and I was like the shoulder to cry on. And it was such like a sweet and sacred space for me to occupy in their lives. And it's kind of like it was kind of my niche. Now, I will say that over time, as I have begun stepping into my own story, I'm seeing that that is also a bit of a pigeonhole, right? Because it's like, as much as I want to be there for other people, like I also need to step into my own story and my own pain, right? And as you say, like grieve well for myself. And so I have been engaging that work. I came into becoming a therapist kind of knowing that I've always had this like very understanding, kind of disarming presence, right? And kind of I can really make sense of people's, like why people do what they do. And that was a process also. Like grad school was like they kind of intentionally tried to like deconstruct a lot of the way that we think, because I think
Yeah.
naturally we think in very black and white ways, very dichotomous thinking, like black and white thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they really pushed us to make a lot of room for the gray. And so I've been kind of living in that space. And so, but I came into grad school not having ever actually gone to a counseling session of my own, but they
Wow.
required that we do our own work. That,
Yeah.
just as Allender says, my program also said, you can only take a client as far as you're willing to go yourself. And I
Yep.
jumped at the opportunity because I just, honestly, the thing that was fueling me is what's wrong with me. The thing
Mm.
that brought me into my first counseling session was shame.
Yeah.
I felt like irrevocably broken in so many
Wow.
ways. And I was seeing my behavior, specifically sinful behavior, through the lens
Mm-hmm.
of what's wrong with me? Why can't I fix this? Why can't
Mm-hmm.
I, like kind of strong arm my way into doing the
Yep.
right things?
Mm.
And was so laden with shame because of like
Yep.
failing in that struggle over and over and over. And
Mm.
the gift that therapy brought me with my first counselor was, Terry, you have to zoom out. You have to look at your
Mm-hmm.
story, that you can't just look at
Yeah.
yourself in light of this moment right now. Like you
Mm-hmm.
have to zoom out. And in that,
Mm-hmm.
like in that process became my like, oh, I do actually make sense. Maybe I'm not
Yeah.
broken, or maybe I am broken, but I have it
Mm-hmm.
broken for a reason. That there were
Yeah.
things in my life that were less than ideal. And so that kind of began me on my journey. And I think that's the kind of beautiful space that I get to hold for other people. Is
Mm-hmm.
I am now getting to like people who come to me and they're stuck, or they feel like they're circling the drain in different aspects of their life. And I get to come and kind of be a witness, but also get to say,
Mm-hmm.
hey, pause. Can we zoom out?
Yeah.
Can we look at you in light of your story and
Mm-hmm.
hold some compassion for you?
Yeah.
And so that looks like a lot of different things that comes out in a lot of different ways. I work with adults, I work with couples, um, but it is such beautiful and meaningful work that I get to like give my life to helping people.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's a little bit of, and I do that in lots of different ways, right? So like the couple of different ways that shows up is like, so I have a private practice, and here in Pensacola, I live in Pensacola, Florida. So I'm a licensed psychotherapist in the state of Florida,
Mm-hmm.
and so I have a private practice in Pensacola. I get to run couples intensives, intensive
Cool.
retreats with my partner Alyssa at Omnia Trauma Healing. I get to run Women of Desire groups with Heather Stringer. I'm an unwanted guide facilitator, so I help people who want to help other people walk through their sexual brokenness and their
Mm-hmm.
sexual stories, and teaching them to listen to their lust, and like there's goodness, like that's where your
Mm-hmm.
wounding lives. And I
Yeah.
just finished a book that will be out in February, and so that's coming into the
Yay.
world too. Yeah, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and that one's called it's called From Barrier to Breakthrough: Finding God Through Our Wondering, Wandering, and Wounding. And so I'm super excited
Mm-hmm.
about all of these beautiful ways that I feel like God has just opened up door after door after door after door
Mm-hmm.
for me to honestly just get to do what I love and what I feel like He's blessed
Mm-hmm.
me and gifted me to do.
Mm-hmm. That is so cool. Yay. I am so excited to hear about the book. Can't wait to read it. And I always say that I judge a book by its subtitle. That is always my favorite part. It's like the title is important, but the subtitle has to like draw my heart in, because that is how I pick a book.
Yeah. And I
So
love
that's
that
so
you say
great.
that, because our subtitle is my favorite part. Like finding God
Yes.
for wondering, wandering, and wounding. Like, yes, like that is my life's
Yes.
work. So,
Hmm.
yes, yes.
Love it. I think one of the really cool things that you said that is important in understand, well, story work, right? That's kind of the more common language for what we're talking about is the idea of your story matters,
Mhm.
and what's happening in the present has shown up before. And so we're reliving a lot of those
Mhm.
narratives and those patterns that we learned as children.
Yeah.
And so for me, one of the questions I always love to equip people with is, what makes this make sense?
Mm.
Right? Whether it's happening in you or it's happening in someone else, of like, this reaction or this behavior, like, it, with the context clues that I'm aware of what's happening,
Mhm.
this storyline makes no sense to me. But
Mhm.
if we can engage in compassionate curiosity for ourselves and for others to say, hey, like, what makes this make sense? Right? So I kind of give examples of like, um if you, well, I mean, this is something I talk about a lot on the podcast, is when I moved to Nashville, I realized I had some trauma with experiencing violence outside of cars. And so I went to park in a parking garage for a concert and couldn't get out of the car, and I was like, oh, had no idea, like, had no idea this was a thing. And so I share that story in different contexts in different ways, and people have heard that before. But um, for me, it was kind of that moment of like, I, I'm not quite sure why this makes sense, but it has to, be somewhere. So I kind of went on the journey of like, oh yeah, I have three really painful experiences with violence. So it makes sense that my body goes, oh, I need to be safe here.
Mhm.
And so it was really sweet. The friend that kind of partnered with me through that panic experience,
Mhm.
a year ago, we just went to another concert together, and she was so kind and provided a lot of safety for me, because I feel like I've done a lot of healing work around that. And there is some shame to it too, of like, this is really weird. Like, I have lived most of my life not even knowing that this was a thing. And then all of a sudden living in this big city. I've always lived in really small towns. I'm living in this big city, and all of a sudden this big core wounding's popping up for me.
Mhm.
And she was so kind, and we got to the venue and I literally laughed so hard. I was like, oh, I don't know that I'm ever going to need that high of a safety bar again,
Mhm.
but I'm really grateful that you offered it to me, because now I can actually show up in that space and go, okay, I'm safe. My needs are taken care of. Like, I'm going to have fun. I'm going to be okay. We just chuckled about it. And I just told her, I'm like, I'm just so grateful that you held space for a really core wounding for me, because it also gave me the opportunity to show up and have a lot of fun.
Mhm.
And for me, that's one of the really cool parts is, yes, the professional part of this journey is wonderful, but the way that when we engage in honoring and understanding our stories, the way that it actually changes our relationships in our everyday life,
Mhm.
it feels so good.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And like this, like what I hear in your story is like sorrow getting turned into joy, like mourning coming into dancing,
Hmm.
and that's happening through
Hmm.
relationship, right? I think there's so
Yeah.
much of God's healing work that happens through relationship.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes I know that I grew up oftentimes with kind of like this mindset that like God's gonna if I'm gonna get it, God's gonna give it to me directly. But
Mm,
there's so much of like where he's like, no, I want you to engage relationship. Like I want you to like this is way messier. Like you don't get to like just
yeah.
look like super clean and like pretty polished Christian, right? Like and
Yeah.
God's just gonna like download it onto you. Like there's so much of it that it's like, oh no, he wants us to like
Hmm.
ugly cry with each other. And he wants us
Yeah.
to like my snot to be on somebody's shoulder. Like
Yeah.
that is like that's the reality of
Hmm.
like healing. Oftentimes it is, we're wounded in relationship, we're healed in relationship.
Hmm. That's so good. Well, as we kind of dive into our conversation today, I
Mhm.
would love to talk about what shapes us in the way that we interact in our relationships. And so, in the context of our conversation today, maybe listeners have, talked about this before, or maybe they haven't. The idea of the science of attachment.
Mhm.
Can we just talk a little bit about like what is attachment,
Mhm.
and how does that show up differently for different people as we're navigating um, the way we're operating in the world?
Sure, sure. So attachment kind of in short is this is the bond between us and our parents, right? And it is the bond
Hmm.
that is required for our survival.
Yeah.
Humans have the longest infancy and kind of like uh,
Wow.
our being a minor, right, lasts longer than any
Mhm.
other mammal on the entire planet, right? So we are so dependent for so long on our caregivers. And so attachment is basically, it's like a survival strategy, right? So if I,
Mhm.
as babies, like we survive via our mother's milk, right? Like, and that's kind of
Mhm.
like, that is the relationship. But that, while we, at some point we get weaned, that relationship continues to remain vital. It's the relationship where I get to experience, ideally, right? I get to experience being seen, right? Like you think about like this, like a baby and a mother, right? And so like
Mhm.
I'm being seen and I'm being delighted in, right? As babies, we get to be attuned to, right? Whenever
Mhm.
we're, when our fear gets big or we get hungry or we get sad or whatever it is that's happening, right? We have a caregiver there who calms us and who soothes us and who's with us, right? And comforts us. And so it's not only like biological survival, right? Where we're dependent
Mhm.
on them for food and drink, but we're also dependent on them like relationally, right? That our brain develops in the way that it is supposed to when we have an attuned caregiver to us, right? We say our caregiver should be accessible, responsive, and engaged. We say, and I'm an emotionally focused therapist, and so we say we're constantly asking each other this question: Are you there for me? And that R is ARE. Are you accessible? Are you responsive? And are you engaged with me? And that's what we're constantly asking of our parents. Now, this does go sideways, right? So,
Mhm.
this goes sideways when let's say, my affect, my emotions, my experience overwhelms my little body, right? Like, I don't, as children, we don't have
Mhm.
words oftentimes for what we're feeling or why we're feeling it. And so I get overwhelmed by my own experience. And so I need my parent to what we call co regulate, which means to like see me, name what I'm feeling,
Yeah.
and to comfort me, and then to help me take action, right? So oftentimes, to my clients, I give this example of like my boys are, they're a year apart, right? So they are best friends and worst enemies, right? So when they were babies
Mhm.
and toddlers, right, like let's say one of them would go and steal the toy from the other person. Well, if I'm attuned and I'm seeing what's happening and I'm accessible and responsive and engaged, best case scenario, my son comes up to me, he's crying, what happened, buddy? Did brother steal your toy? Oh, come here, you look so sad. And I give him a hug and I wrap him up,
Yeah.
and let's go talk about taking turns with brother, right? So
Mhm.
that's like best case scenario, right? So I saw what happened, I named the emotion, I offered myself as comfort and care,
Mm.
and then we take action towards what needs to happen.
Yep.
So that is and the good news is, for those of us that are parents, is that hey, only we only have to get this right 33% of the time in order to create secure attachment in our children.
Mhm.
Thank you, Jesus,
Love it.
right? Because, right, like I'm not going to get it right all of the time. And I'm not going to be paying attention because chances are I'm going to be doing dishes or folding laundry or at my job or something, right? And I'm going to miss
Yep.
all of those opportunities. And so, um, when things don't go well, then we're left alone with our emotion, right? So if that happened and
Mhm.
mom wasn't there, or
Yeah.
mom was preoccupied in relational distress, if I was drinking or heavily medicated in some way, shape, or form, right? Whether that's drugs
Yep.
or alcohol or whatever that is. Whether that is I am a super fragile person and I just need everybody to be okay all the time because I'm like anxious or I'm fragile or I'm like,
Mhm.
I just can't take anymore. Like I'm at my capacity all the time. I don't have any room as the mom to absorb the experience of my child.
Mm.
This could be absence and abandonment, right? So like
Mhm.
my parents just, they're physically not there. It can look like lots of different things, right? But for whatever reason or
Yeah.
another, for whatever reason, the parent is not accessible, responsive, and engaged. And in those situations, typically we will form one of two, sometimes three different kinds of attachment styles. So if the parent is intermittently available, sometimes they're available, sometimes they're not. The kid never really knows. What happens is the child then learns to become very, very vigilant and will look
Mhm.
for like, I'm looking for, I'm looking for um, the any signs that mom's available. I'm trying to read the situation. Is she? Is she not? And of course, when I'm saying mom, I also can mean dad, right? I'm talking about the attachment, like caregivers.
Yeah.
But typically, oftentimes it's moms playing that role. And so that creates like an intermittent responsiveness, creates vigilance in the child that makes them kind of like scrutinize every single little sign. And that creates what we call an anxious attachment. And
Mhm.
we'll talk about what these look like in adult relationships in just a minute. But so that
Yeah.
creates an anxious attachment. And so that's like a constantly like, it's again, a constant vigilance, a constant looking. I can
Mhm.
reach for my needs to get met, but sometimes I have to like I get really scared. Like the
Yeah.
emotion gets really, really big. And that's how I get my needs met. Right. Another thing that can happen is if the caregiver is not available, like just generally not available. You think about the parent that had to work two jobs just to make ends meet. They're literally not
Mhm.
available, right? Because like dad took off and mom had to take on two jobs. And kid had to go to the nanny or the next door neighbor or whatever,
Yeah.
right? In those situations, when the parent is like not accessible, then the child will literally like bury their need and they will learn how to not feel. They cut themselves off from their feelings. And that's what we call an avoidant attachment. And
Mhm.
avoidantly attached people are actually more anxious than anxiously attached people. That if you were to actually
Interesting.
read their bodies, um,
Wow.
yeah, and so we've there's lots of different ways that we've kind of measured this, that research has measured this, because they're actually expending more energy trying to push down all of the feelings and all of the needs, right? Those
Yeah.
needs don't ever have an opportunity to come up. We're just really good, and I say we because I come from a little bit of an avoidant background, that we're just really good at having the flat affect. Like we're in huge distress, but no one knows, because
Yeah.
what's the point of letting anyone know if no one's coming,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So that's the
So.
avoidantly attached person. The kind of worst case scenario is what we call a disorganized attachment. And this is the situations in which the caregiver was also the person who was abusing or traumatizing the child. It creates
Mm.
like a push pull. It creates I need you. I literally am biologically like dependent on you for my survival.
Yeah.
But also you are the source that hurts me more than anyone, and you're the source of
Oof.
betrayal. So it creates
Mm.
such like an I need you, don't come too close. I need you, but don't come too close. And it creates a kind of what we call disorganized attachment inside. Yeah.
Yeah.
So and then these people, we all grow up, right? And this is
Mhm.
we typically, we don't always match our attachment style with our parents to our loved ones.
Mhm.
Specifically, our partners, whoever that is, we will oftentimes find with different levels of safety, we can find different types of attachment, but most of
Yeah.
us have a default. Most of
Mhm.
us, we will have, and this is not, none of the beauty is, none of this is permanent, right? Like as a
Yeah.
couples therapist, as an EFT therapist, I'm always trying to help people to come to what we call an earned secure attachment. So,
Mm.
in other words, we earn
That's
it
good.
through over and over and over this kind of
Yeah.
repeated process. We talk about you know, every relationship is going to experience rupture, right? But
Mhm.
when we can repair the rupture, that creates
Mhm.
resilience. And so when
Mhm.
we have done that enough times, we have done that over and over and over, we actually create resilient relationships and secure attachment. And this can be with friends, this can be with your partner, this can be with your
Mhm.
parents if they're willing to engage in that fight.
Yeah.
That these things can be healed, but it is a
Mm.
lot of work to rewrite the circuitry, right? That we
Mhm.
have inside of us.
Yeah. That's so good. I just think that there's this space, right? Because I can hear parts of I would lean more heavily when I feel unsafe towards anxious attachment.
Hmm.
What can I fix? How can I control? How can I get all the details to be safe?
Hmm.
Um, and so, but being able to watch the space of like, even just like what I talked about, the example with my friend is like,
Hmm.
as I've built, um, really safe connections with people, being able to really live in that secure attachment of like, I'm here, I matter, you matter.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
when there's conflict, it doesn't have to mean disconnection. It actually can mean even deeper connection
That's right.
because both people are showing up to
Mhm.
be loving and kind and safe.
Yeah.
And so, can we talk a little bit about like what we talked about the examples of what it looks like for children.
Mhm.
So, as we get to grown-ups and as this is living out, can we talk about some like practical examples of what people can kind of pay attention to of like if I notice myself in these types of patterns, this might give me a heads up to what type of attachment style I typically lean towards.
Sure, sure, yeah. So let's start with kind of anxiously attached people. Well, actually, let's start with
Mhm.
secure because let's give
Yeah.
this like a home base, right? Like this is where we want to be. So
Mhm.
securely attached people can, first of all, they know their value and they know the value of the other
Mhm.
person,
That's good.
and they're wanting to honor that, and they are wanting to both reach. They will reach to get their needs met, and they want to
Mhm.
be responsive and reach and get the and meet the other person's needs as well. So it's this is language like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do that for you, but if you give me 3 days, I think we can make that work this day, right? So it's an
Mhm.
honoring of self and an honoring of other.
Yep.
It's a sense of um, there's this idea of Martin Buber writes about what's called the I thou, which means it's almost like
Mhm.
like there is the image of God in me and there's an image of God
Yeah.
in you, and that we can connect on that level.
Mm. Yeah.
Like there's a beauty in I don't have to abandon myself to meet your
Mhm.
needs, and you don't have to abandon yourself to meet my needs.
So good.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like there is the phrase that I use with my clients oftentimes is like, hey, like our God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, right?
Mhm.
Like he wants you to come in and go out and find pasture. There's so much room for you. There's
Yeah.
so much room for you. We don't have to get
Mhm.
competitive. We don't have to get petty. We don't have to like do all of these things that we do to like try to like be his favorite, right? Because
Mhm.
there is no such thing, right? Like
Mhm.
we are all his favorite. And so
Yep.
there is this beauty and this freedom in honoring self and other.
Good.
And then if we look at the like anxiously attached folks, again, these are people who I think the beauty that people with an anxious attachment bring to the world is oftentimes
Mhm.
they're the ones who find the problems in the system, right? They're
Mhm.
oftentimes the ones that are like, because they've had to pay such vigilant attention to know when
Mhm.
is mom available and when is mom not available. Anxiously attached people oftentimes are the ones, they're the ones in who are have like a wholly disruptive anger, right? They're the ones
Mhm.
that are just like, this is a problem and let's fix it, right? We talk about in
Yeah.
EFT, we talk about anger is a protest. It's a protest against what's
Mhm.
wrong. And
Yeah.
so, oftentimes, if you are typically the person who is voicing, these are
Mhm.
how things need to change or how things need to improve, that's
Yeah.
often a sign of anxious attachment. Um,
Wow.
Also, anxiously attached people, um, they tend to like their emotion and anxiety get kind of wound together. And
Mhm.
so emotion in our bodies is supposed to function like a wave. So when we
Mhm.
feel anger or fear or sadness, grief, it's supposed to rise inside of us. And then there's like a very intense, like 60 to 90-second window where it's like going to
Mhm.
peak and then it goes
Mhm.
over. And then it's like there's the, and if you've ever had like
Yep.
the post cry headache or like the like exhaustion, right? Like a wave of emotion just moved through your body.
Mm.
But when anxiety gets attached to our emotions, anxiety doesn't have an end. It doesn't function like a wave. It functions,
Mm.
perpetuates itself because when
Yeah.
we're anxious, our thoughts race. And
Mhm.
so racing thoughts and an anxious body and the emotion all kind of get tied together. And the emotion just keeps going and going and going and going and going. And it
Mhm.
perpetuates itself rather than
Yeah.
actually getting to move through the emotion. So oftentimes,
Mhm.
anxiously attached people are afraid of their emotions, even though their emotions are
Mm.
really big. They kind of
Yeah.
have an ambivalent relationship with their emotions because they're like,
Mm,
if I start crying, I won't stop. It's something I
mm,
often hear from my anxiously attached clients.
yeah.
Um, yeah. I want to pause and check in. Any questions about that before I move on to avoidant?
That's good. I just think that there's the space of like the gift of it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because, and this is not what I'm hearing from you, just think about the culture in which we all live in, especially in how we have access to a lot of free therapy type conversations on the internet,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
right? It's kind of like, oh, here's all the bad things, let's get better. But also like seeing the beauty. This is a weird statement, but like the beauty that our dysfunctions have brought us, which I think that's why there's a grief process. There is a grief in getting healthy and changing your life because
Mm-hmm.
the ecosystem that you once lived in your dysfunction that dies, and that's still sad.
Mm-hmm.
It's good
Mm-hmm.
because we can go through the other side to be happier, healthier, more connected humans,
Yeah.
but there still is a death process that goes, oh whoa, like I don't I'm not constantly the hypervigilant one responsible for everything. Like there's an identity loss there because I'm not showing up like that anymore. I'm showing up in this new identity, which is I matter, you matter, we're both safe.
Mm-hmm.
But also to say, hey, like it is okay. And that doesn't mean, right? It doesn't mean that, you know, anytime you feel anxious that you're automatically, living in some sort of dysfunctional pattern or whatever that may be. But I think being able to hold both of like, yeah, our core wounding also is a place, right? That's the spiritual part of this, of like
Mm-hmm.
there's the beauty of you are deeply gifted and wired a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
which then comes in and gets twisted by whatever language we want to use, trauma or sin or, you know, um, generational trauma or whatever we want to talk about in that space,
Mm-hmm.
to go, oh, this thing that actually is really beautiful about me in my essence, it's been used and twisted in a way that has been really harmful to myself and others.
Mm-hmm.
But if I can come back to that um, if I can come back to just the essence of it, just kind of neutral,
Yeah.
right? Of like I'm just coming back to the anxiety as a neutral thing, not as a good thing or a bad thing, and then I can decide and figure out, is this going to push me towards helpful healing behaviors, or am I going to use this to lean towards harmful, hurtful thoughts and behaviors that's going to affect myself and others.
Right. And I would add, Bridget, to that, that like the beauty is like God never left us.
Hmm.
When my mom wasn't available, when my
Yep.
mom went in my trauma, in the absence and abandonment, like God has taken what the enemy meant for evil, and He's used it for good, and our
Mm-hmm.
wounding becomes our weapon, right?
Yeah.
Like
Love that.
that's the beauty, is that
Hmm.
none of it gets wasted. None of it
Hmm.
gets wasted. Even our harm,
Hmm.
even the places where we hurt. Like God is
Mm.
still working something good in those places.
Yeah. Love it.
Yeah.
Well, let's dig into some avoidant. What does that look like?
Yeah. Yeah. So the avoidantly attached humans in your life, or if you are one, oftentimes this person is like, they're like the rock, right? Like they're the person that like, they don't necessarily have a lot of feelings, but they're the person, like they're the, like the strong one. They're the one that everybody depends on. They kind of like hold everybody
Mm-hmm.
together. Oftentimes these are very high achieving humans because they need
Mm.
nothing. They have learned to push their needs and their
Wow.
feelings so far down that it's like, oh, this is going to be your lawyer and your med student
Mm-hmm.
and the doctors in your life, right? These are going to be the people who are like, oh, and oftentimes they're so disconnected from their bodies and from their feelings that they're so cognitive and so
Mm-hmm.
logical and come across oftentimes so brilliant, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's because really they're living with half their brain. They're living with their left brain and not their right brain, right? They're living with
Yeah.
logic and language and reason, and they're not necessarily getting any of the cues that their body's trying to get them for, like, you need to stop
Mm-hmm.
and you need to rest and you need to eat and you know, all of those kinds of things. Like, those of us that are avoidant are kind of, it's a process um, to become embodied again and to actually be able to receive those messages
Mm.
from our bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so these people, like, again, I love what you were saying. Like, the gift that they bring is often like they're so steady, right? They
Yeah.
feel so stable in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes it can also feel like, if you're in relationship with this kind of person, they probably feel like somewhat stoic, somewhat dry. Like, there's not a lot
Mm.
to, there's a lot of intellect to attach to, but not a lot of like that, like, emotional softness
Mm.
and warmth to attach to.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I think there's space in that to um like to honor where how it's protected you,
Mhm.
right? I think that's a big thing is like we do need to be provided for and protected. Like that is a human need. And so, right, if go back to what makes this make sense, right? If the narrative of our childhood was in order for me to be protected and provided for, I must behave in X, Y, and Z, right? Depending on the context that you were raised in, it's going to show up that way to
Mhm.
go, okay, for me to be provided for and protected, like I have to know all the answers. And I just have to like go under the radar, don't be seen, don't be heard.
Yeah.
Or the other side of like, no, if I'm going to be protected and provided for, like I have to be the one doing that.
That's
Like
right.
I
I have
have
to
to be the
take
one
care of myself
offering
because no one else
the
is doing it.
yeah.
Mhm.
And so I think even yesterday I had a conversation. I'm really grateful with a close friend. We were talking through some work stuff, and all of a sudden I just stopped. I took a breath and I put my hand on my heart, and I just was like, I'm feeling a lot of fear that I'm going to get in trouble.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I was just like, I just need to share that with you. And literally, I just need to get it out. And he just was really kind. And he's like, wow, thank you for sharing that with me.
Mhm.
Um, because we did need to work through some logistics of like, hey, I missed something that the company needed to move forward, and so that's okay. We do need to talk about, we do need to talk about how are we providing for the people,
Yeah.
but it also was really because I felt my body start to like get defensive of like
Mhm.
I have to prove that I'm good right now, and I'm like, okay, wait a second, what's happening? It's like, oh, I fear that I'm going to get in trouble.
Mhm.
Can I share that? Can I have safety in that space? Um, which is part of the learning. So I kind of would love to kind of shift into that of like,
Mhm.
how do we in everyday life start to practice
Mhm.
creating secure attachments that goes, you matter, I matter,
Mhm.
and I have the right to exist. I love that. Like, I have the right to take up space. That phrase has been so important to me this year. I actually got some artwork made. Like, you have a right to exist. You have a right to take up space.
Mhm.
And it started. This is a funny story about that. For me, I feel like I have lots of lots of stories of examples. Um, but when I realized that I had my life trauma narrative meant get really small in order to be taken care of, like just try to be really small.
Mhm.
One of the biggest shifts that I did was I went and bought a giant pocketbook. And I was like, I need to make sure that like I have everything that I need with me, and it's okay that like it's annoying because it takes up a lot of space. Wherever I'm going to put this bag, it's going to take up a lot of space, and even that felt like I felt a shame experience of like,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, like you're taking up too much physical space in this room. And it was a simple thing, but it was real. And I did it intentionally. Like, I did it intentionally to say, hey, like, let's just practice what this actually physically feels like for you to ask for more and to be worthy of being seen in that space. And I've kind of retired that bag now, and I still use it for certain things. But like, it was one of those. It was something simple
Mhm.
where most people were going to have no idea that that was happening. But for me, I knew. I was like, when I am carrying this bag, I am actively participating
Mm.
in practicing secure attachment and practicing that I have a right to exist on this big planet.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Hmm. Yeah, it's such a good question. I'm thinking about so many different pieces, and kind of ways to come at, like, how do we grow a
Hmm.
secure attachment?
Yeah.
Um, I think something that you what I'm part of what I'm hearing and what you just shared is, and you named it really beautifully earlier, like that, like compassionate curiosity, right? That
Hmm.
when we if we have an anxious or an avoidant, any kind of an insecure attachment, right, we are going to feel like I am going to overwhelm. If I am overwhelmed, I am going to overwhelm, and then I'm going to lose relationship. That person, like the person who I'm in relationship with, is going to like cut me off. They're going to be overwhelmed by me. They're going to go away. And so
Hmm.
especially for me as a kind of more avoidant person, like this kind of feeling of like having to keep it like all tucked in, like
Hmm.
I can't be messy. I can't be, like you said, like take up space. And so, and this is where healing is not linear, um,
Mm-mm.
because um, I'm trying to think of, there's so many things that I want to say about this. So, for example, for me, as a person who was learning to engage my emotional experience, learning
Hmm.
to listen to my body, right? So 80% of the messages between the brain and the body are coming from the body to the brain. Only
Wow.
20% of the information comes from the brain to the body. And so
Wow.
those of us who are not connected to our bodies
Hmm.
are not getting 80% of the information.
Hmm.
Right. So in my practice, I talk about, like, in the same way that thoughts live in our heads, emotions live in our bodies. We have
Hmm.
to practice this idea of interoception, that I actually turn
Hmm.
my attention not outward, but I actually turn my
Hmm.
attention inward. And when I turn my attention inward, my body is having sensations, right? Emotions are called
Hmm.
feelings because we feel them as a sensation in our bodies.
Mm. Yeah.
And so there is a process in which we must begin to learn to re engage our bodies,
Hmm.
because our emotions, so we say, like, emotions are information, and they're trying to get our attention. They're trying to tell us
Yeah.
something. We say they're indicators, not dictators, right? That's what kind of a
Hmm.
fun saying, right, about emotion, is they're indicators and not dictators. What that means is they don't get the final say, but they're trying to tell me something. So I need to take in the data. I need to take them in as information. Um, and so part of that is learning to tune in, right? That can be like a practice of silence and solitude, and just like sitting
Hmm.
with my felt experience, just
Hmm.
doing like a body scan, starting from the top of my
Hmm.
head all the way down to the bottom of my feet. What is my
Hmm.
body holding for me from today?
Yeah.
Um, I think so
That's good.
that's part of it. But I will say that, again, as a person who did not have a lot of experience with my emotion, that they are very inconvenient, right? When you're used to being like the
Hmm.
rock and the stable one all of the time, and then like
Hmm.
emotion just comes bubbling to the surface, and it's like out of
Yep.
control, and it's like I no longer have the mechanisms to push it down like I used to.
Hmm.
It can, as your point, Bridget, like, it can bring up so much shame of like, oh, I'm taking up too much space, I'm feeling too much, I'm burdening
Mm.
people with myself.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so part of it, and that's where it's like, okay, so like that is actually progress, that is actually
Hmm.
steps forward, because I'm actually gaining access to my emotional experience. Now I just have to learn how to tolerate it in relationship, right? It's
Yeah.
one thing for me to feel things, it's another thing for me to bring those things into relationship.
Yeah.
Right? And so
Yeah.
that is, I think that would be another aspect um,
Hmm.
of we're not meant to be alone. And
Yeah.
those of us who are used to being we all want to be seen as like strong and reliable and
Yeah.
trustworthy. Like we have these positive ways of thinking about ourselves. But if we're honest, that's only part of the story. It's maybe half,
Mhm.
probably not even half
Mhm.
of the story, right? The
Mhm.
truth is, like, there's a lot of messy and there's a lot of wounding and there's a lot of
Mhm.
limitation and vulnerability and weakness. And we
Mhm.
have, I think there's such a sense of like, can I just like welcome my humanity?
Mhm.
We just welcome our humanity and actually greet all of those edges with kindness.
Mhm. Yeah.
Can we invite them? Right. There's more to say
Mhm.
about that, but I want to check in with you, Bridget. What's stirring for you?
No, that's so good. I just think about like this is why it's super helpful to check in with a therapist, with a coach, with someone who's doing this work because we're not meant to do it by ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to have space where you can go like, I don't know what's happening, and someone who's really good at this because this does take practice, right? That's why the idea of having a professional sit with you and walk. I mean, I still have people that I meet with, and which is super important, and being able to check in and just say, hey, like, I'm needing some help here. I'm needing some help here. I'm a little stuck.
Mm-hmm.
But then, language I like to use with my clients is like, we're just learning to honor what's happening, and
Mm-hmm.
I love to fix it. And I'd love to say that, like, you know, I'd love to give you some magic wand that says you're just going to get over this and this is never going to be triggering ever again. But in reality, that's not how life works. And I'm super sorry. But what we can do is we can find tools that says every time the sadness or shame or fear pops up, like I can actually learn to honor it.
Mm-hmm.
And the really cool thing about, our bodies is that our bodies will learn a new kind narrative that says, "Oh, when I experience pain, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm not abandoning me anymore."
Yes. Yes.
And that's when our bodies go, "Okay, like I can handle this conflict, or I can handle this new situation, or I can handle this anxiety." It's like, "Okay, great." Like I think a lot of it is rebuilding that self-trust of like what these insecure attachments do is they warp in some self-abandonment
Mm-hmm.
um that says like just jump ship. And so when we can actually come back to ourselves, and again that's a bigger conversation for another day,
Mm-hmm.
but kind of returning back to ourself of I'm here, I matter, here I am in this space, here's the people that I want to come towards, right? And I think there's this other part of it is that we learn that there are people that we have in our circles that may need to be at a further distance, and that's okay.
Yeah. And that's the beauty, right? Bridget's like the, as
Hmm.
you're saying that, I think that is where this is where I'm so like body based, emotion based, like come
Hmm.
back to the body because
Yeah.
the body is so wise. It's
Yep.
so wise. And so like when something doesn't feel right, your body
Hmm.
is will tell you. There
Yep.
is such a knowing, such an intuition
Hmm.
inside that says, okay, red
Hmm.
flag, right? Like
Yep.
keep that person at a distance.
Hmm.
There is a even anger, right? Like my access, having access to my anger is, I always think anger is my emotional boundary setter. It's my
Yep.
advocate, right? Like anger is
Hmm.
such an important piece.
That's
And
good.
there's so much where, you know, we're not going to talk about parts today. And I know we've talked a little bit about like, we're going to have that conversation
Hmm.
about, the kind of all the different parts working inside of us. But learning to come back to ourself, like our core
Hmm.
self, and being able to
Yep.
cultivate what you just said, cultivate relationship with ourselves that is
Hmm.
compassionate and kind, and knowing that this is a process. This is a
Hmm.
lifelong process. There is not an outcome. There is not an
Yep.
A at the end of the 9 weeks that we are searching for,
Hmm.
right? Like
Yep.
this is a lifelong process of being able to engage with ourselves
Mm.
with such kindness and compassion,
Yeah.
and being able to value ourselves. I think that's the other thing in the self-abandoning piece is like I think that
Hmm.
takes so many different forms, and
Hmm.
oftentimes that can mean, not only does it look like people pleasing, right? And like, oh, I
Hmm.
have to be what everyone else needs me to be, or I need to make, it's my job to make everybody else happy.
Mm.
understanding that we have value for our being, not for
Yeah.
our doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
We often say we're human beings, not human doings,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so this idea of like, I have value because I am. I have value because I bear the image of God,
Mm-hmm.
and that is enough. So it's
Yep.
not based on what I do for other people. It's not based on how my body looks. It's not based on what someone else thinks of me. There's all of these different ways that we're constantly giving our power away when we're looking for all of this external validation, right?
Mm.
But the bind that external validation puts us in is that even when we get the validation, it's a sieve, right? It's an empty vessel. It's a broken vessel. It's got holes in the bottom of it. It doesn't
Yep.
hold. And so when
Mm.
we begin to greet ourselves with compassion and kindness and find value in who I am and not what I do,
Yeah.
that's the container. That's when I
Mm.
can actually believe good things about myself and offer
Yeah.
good things to the world.
Mm. Beautiful.
Mhm.
Love it. Love it. Well, there's 1,000 more things that we could discuss
I
today, but
know. I know.
sadly, we're coming to the end of our conversation. And I know that this was probably a really good note taking episode. And so, if people are sitting and saying, "Hey, I would love to learn more from Tara," how can they connect with you online to learn more about what you're offering and ways to connect with you?
Yeah, thanks. So I am on social media. On Instagram, I'm Tara Riggs, LMFT, Licensed Marriage and Family Therapist, is what that stands for.
Mhm.
On Instagram, Inner Light Counseling Collective is my Facebook page. And then innerlightcounselingpcola.com is my website.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for being here today. Is there anything, as we wrap up, anything that you haven't said that you want to say? Um, just a golden nugget to leave our listeners with as we head out.
I would just say, this healing process is not done in a vacuum, right? That
Hmm.
we get to bear witness to each other's glory and each
Yeah.
other's healing and each other's wholeness. And
Mhm.
that we can be like conduits of grace and growth and goodness that like spur one another on in this process. Um, and that is what the world needs.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tara. Friends, if this episode was impactful for you, we'd love to hear. So please reach out on social media. Either send us a message or comment or share this episode with your friends. That's how we grow together when we're learning together. And I pray that these conversations are things that you can listen to with your family and with your friends to say, hey, like, I'm curious, or I would love to start having some conversations in our relationship. Would you want to journey with me? And we just pray that it is encouraging and enlightening to you as you listen. So we'll see you next time on the Recover Your Life podcast.